whatever greeting one gives on Teves to all of you. This year, just like last year, the year before, so the Shiur that's given on Teves, try to steer it, connect it to inyanim that relate to the teichen of the day of Teves, the inyan of Svarim. So last year, I spoke about the halachic significance of Svarim in the context of Hilchas Talmud Torah. There's this idea of a chiyuv, yediyas HaTorah, to remember Torah, not to forget Torah. You have all of these inyanim. So how do Svarim play into that? How do they affect? Do they change the din at all? Which is more of a personal, individual, your chiyuv of yediyah, your chiyuv of zikarim. Right, so the shaila was, did Svarim change this? And did Svarim change this when the first Svarim were introduced? Do developments in the world of Svarim subsequently, did the halacha perhaps change more recently for some reason? So that was the focus last year. And Bechlal talking about the role Svarim play today in our learning. And I think there were some, if I may say so myself, some interesting ideas one can debate and discuss. You could check those out. This year I want to go off in a bit of a related but different direction. Also the question of Svarim and their impact on halacha. But instead of discussing our inyan of Talmud Torah, Yediyas HaTorah, there's also the Mesiras HaTorah, the idea that a Rabbi teaches his Talmud Torah from generation to generation. That's a big, important element, seemingly, of how Torah is transmitted. And how do Svarim figure into that? Seems to some extent that Svarim are somewhat of a substitute. You can be an autodidact, you can teach yourself from Svarim. So the question is, what halachic significance, what halachic ramifications do Svarim have in this area? Now, of course, we know that when the very first inyanim of Torah were written down, Torah Sheba'al Peh, we know that itself raised questions. We know that Rambam, of course, writes in his Akdama to Mishnah Torah, Lama Asar Rabbeinu HaKadosh Kach, why did the Rabbi change the situation? So the conditions in the world are changing. The conditions that would allow the Torah to be transmitted in the traditional way are changing. It's becoming quite rather difficult. So chibur echa liyas biyad kulam. So there will be one central chibur that we can refer to. Obviously, that itself, the history of the writing of Torah Sheba'al Peh or compilation of Torah Sheba'al Peh is its own topic, its own discussion. Not getting into that now. And to a certain extent, you can describe the Rambam's Hakdama to Mishnah Torah as an overview, a historical overview from that point on of how each important sefer was written successively up until his point in time. And of course, the reason why the Rambam is writing all of this is because he was announcing his contribution of a new major sefer in a line of important svarim. So that means it's not just a technical. We're not just talking about the technical question of are you looking inside while you're learning, or you're trying to memorize, and how much can you memorize, and how much. It clearly changes. It clearly shifts the entire nature of how learning is done in every way. So on a day like this, where we're placing svarim and purchasing svarim at the center of everything, like the Rebbe said, that's the ikar inyan of the day. So one can raise a number of questions from a number of angles. How central, how important are svarim meant to be in our lives? Meaning, obviously learning Torah as a mitzvah is at the center of our lives. But where are svarim in the picture? When we think of learning Torah, are svarim, by definition, that's part of the picture? Is it mamish integral to what we mean when we say we're learning Torah? And if yes, which svarim are we talking about? Which svarim are mamish? That's part of Torah, that's part of Yiddishkeit. Are we just talking about the most important ones, the major ones, the ones that Rambam listed, plus maybe up until the Shulchan Aruch? Or are we talking about hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of Sfarim of all types that have been created or constantly being created? Or to put it in more halachic terms, we know when it comes to the mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah, that from the Rosh and on, we have this idea, this gedank, that we're Mekayim Ksiva Sefer Torah through writing Svarim or through buying Svarim. So what is the chiyuv? What is the chiyuv of buying Svarim bizmaneno? And is Teves essentially an expression to what could be possibly a chiyuv, part of how we have to practice Yiddishkeit, practice learning Torah? To what degree is the idea, Teves, we're going to go buy Svarim, how does that fit into that? Obviously, when the Rebbe spoke about Teves, the implication was buying many Svarim, not just a small number. I think, B'chla, if you think about it, you can look at society, we can divide society into different groups. Obviously, there's some people that don't really have Svarim at all, but for those who have Svarim, you have those that are more into the basic Svarim, they have the basic sets throughout the generations. And of course, there could be that itself, there could be different ranges of how many Svarim you have that you consider to be basic Svarim. And then you have those that are buying tons and tons of Svarim of all kinds. It's the variety. They have a very interesting library of Svarim, different different Svarim personalities. Just as an illustration from the Rebbe, it's always risky to try to use examples from the Rebbe. It might be contentious of whether we can use the Rebbe as an example within these discussions. But on the chance that we could learn something, so just recently they published again very interesting letter from the Rebbe, from Tafshin Yud Beis. The Rebbe wrote to Reb Shalom Chaskind, who was on the move, Morocco, Eretz Yisrael. And at this point he was in Eretz Yisrael. And everyone knew that the Rebbe's library is interested in Svarim, the Rebbe is interested in Svarim. So he had sent a catalog from some Merchas Svarim to the Rebbe. The Rebbe is writing back about how the Rebbe is not looking to pay cash, rather to exchange for Sifrei Kahas, and how to work that out. And then at the end of the letter, there's this unusual section. The Rebbe says, Reshimas HaSafarim HaMa'anyinim Oisi. Here's a list of Svarim that I am interested in. And I challenge most of us to be able to identify almost any of them. I'd be surprised. I guess we can give out points for how many you're able to. There's 15 items, but in some of them there are multiple Svarim. First sefer is Beis Lechem Yehuda on Eitz Chaim. Who's that? That's Rabbi Yehuda Fatia from Iraq, lived at the beginning of the 1900s. Iraqi Kabbalist. The next sefer is the Leshem Shvoy V'Achlama, which is the big Litvish Mekobel of Eliashiv's grandfather, Reb Shlomo Eliashiv. It's very big and popular today among those that are looking for a Litvish version of Kabbalah and Machshava. Shloim Yerushalayim from Mekubal from Teman that moved to Eretz Yisrael in the 1800s. Me'il Kodesh Bigdei Yesha from Mekubal who moved from Greece to Eretz Yisrael in the 1800s. All kinds of very, very interesting Svarim. All of them are Kabbalah. You have others as well. Nishma Shabtai Alevi, Leket Yosef Nachas Ben Yom and Divrei Shol Minchas Omer. Whole list of very interesting Svarim. Just to give a glimpse into the Rebbe's Rishimas HaSfarim HaMa'anyinim Oisi. So obviously, if we had to try to characterize the Rebbe in terms of Svarim, very eclectic, very broad, all types, and that's what you see in Rebbe's Igris, look at the Sichas, definitely to a great extent, casting a very wide net, to the extent that we can make that harder. Anyway, so that's one question. What importance do Svarim have in our learning? How many Svarim do we want, do we need? Another question we can ask is, what is, like I said before, that Svarim in a sense are competing with a teacher. So what is the status of Svarim vis-a-vis having learning Torah from a Rabbi? Some ask, are you allowed to paskin from Svarim? Or some ask the question for Kert, that says, and halachic you're supposed to be mechabed your Rebbe. Is there still an Indian to be mechabed your Rebbe, the way Chazal describe, or Rishayim describe? Or maybe today, lav dafka is Indian of Kvoid Rabbi, because you have Svarim. Now, there chatzachos, we can add that today it's not just a question of svarim per se, because today we have databases and other digital tools and things are shifting in that direction. And in a certain sense, svarim and all these things are all just various technologies for making knowledge accessible. So if you look at it that way, so it's just part of the evolution of knowledge. Even in more recent months, if you want to make it extra acute, we're seeing very tremendous advancements in AI chat, and we're seeing the ability for an AI bot to sort of grab information from various sources and put it together and respond to questions, and people are already asking, people are already thinking. Until now, it felt a little more theoretical. Now that people are seeing an early instantiation of this technology in practice, even though obviously right now it has many shortcomings and you wouldn't actually rely on it in any sphere, take its word for fact. But the assumption being that it can make even more progress, and at some point it will be almost foolproof. So could we reach a point at some point where AI is part of the equation of how we learn or how we paskin? Is it the same vart? Is it the same nafkamina of what the role of svarim is? Okay, so to get a little bit into the inyanim, so last year, among other things, part of the discussion was this question of, does the development in the tchum of svarim, does that change halacha? Like I said, last year we were focusing more on just your yediyas hatayra. Here we're asking in a broader context. So we quoted from the Alter Rebbe. So in certain pratim, the Alter Rebbe said, even though we have svarim, it doesn't change your chiv of zikara, and that was that whole discussion. But even in Perek Beis of Hilchos Talmud Torah, the Alter Rebbe says, "V'achshav she'Torah shebapek ksuva lefanenu, ein tzarech lachzer me'apam v'achas b'shas limudim mamish." Now we don't have to chazer 101 times. In case you're wondering why we're not chazer 101, the Alter Rebbe says that's one thing that changed. You don't have to chazer 101 times. Few. So we see that the Alter Rebbe is acknowledging certain changes. That's still about your own limud. But then also we mentioned that in Perek Aleph, the Alter Rebbe says, "Ubizman hazeh shekol haTorah shebal peh iksuva lefanenu ein tzarech liskor melamed levnoi shilamdenu kol haTorah shebal peh elo shilamdenu lahavin hetiv b'talmud b'reiv hamakaymis." So here is already about the Rav of a child, at least. The Alter Rebbe is saying that the nature of that Rav's job, his purpose, has changed because we're working with svarim now, and now we're just leaving the human parts. He's going to help you learn how to think. Maybe svarim can't do that or couldn't do that. So that's the Rav's role has been limited to this point. Also, Nuchas Pesach, we mentioned Siman Eish Mem Heis, if given right at the beginning, the Alter Rebbe says that B'deiris halalu she'ein hachacham sheinu letalmid of halachas lefi sha'akol kasav b'sefer. Alter Rebbe mentions that there as well. This is more along the lines of what I want to talk about, because the Alter Rebbe is mentioning how Svarim changed the role of the Rav of the child, the Rav of the community. So let's expand a bit on that. Right, so if you look there in Hilchos Pesach, I said Siman, okay, I think I made a mistake there with the Siman, something wrong with that. No, it's Siman Tav Chav Tes. Eish Mem Hei is the beginning of Hilchos Shabbos. Siman Tav Chav Tes. Right, so Alter Rebbe gives background to the drasha of Shabbos Agadol, Hilchos Achag B'Chag, Shleishim Yom Kedem Haregel, Takanu Zu Loines Batlo Mi Yisrael. And then the Alter Rebbe says, "B'deiris halalu she'ein hachacham she'ein letalmid of halachas lefi sha'akol kasav b'sefer mitzvah kol echad v'echad sheyumer Hilchos Haregel Kedem Haregel ad sheyibaki behem v'yeda ma'aser sheyasa." So now it's your own responsibility. It changed. And Sif Dalet. So that was about Shleishim Yom Kedem Haregel. And Sif Dalet about Shabbos Agadol. So weiter, the Shabbos Agadol drasha is supposed to be about halachas hatzriches, and that's the tikkun Moshe Rabbeinu tikkun then Yisrael. And weiter, v'achshav einegel nidr halachas b'chag atzma v'shakol kasav b'sefer. The drasha wasn't his battle. The drasha wasn't his Shabbos Agadol drasha is still a thing, but medarshan ba'agada. That the history of the drasha and how the nature of the drasha has changed or evolved over time is its own interesting topic, which we're also not discussing right now at the moment. So apparently this is a chiddush in the Alter Rebbe. Apparently up until the Alter Rebbe, it was never formulated this way. You have Shulchan Aruch, Nesakem, talk about Shleishim Yom and Shabbos Agadol. Now the Rebbe just comes straight out and says, reality has changed, we have Sfarim, you can learn it yourself, you don't need any Rebbe to teach you the halachas. Question is, where did the Alter Rebbe get this from? So, there's a shtickle by Rav Nachum Greenwald, which is one of a number of shticklach I'm incorporating here into this discussion. So he has a shtickle on this, also touches on the things we discussed last year, but so he suggests that what's the makar of the Alter Rebbe? The makar of the Alter Rebbe is a lechem mishnah on the Rambam Menuchas Talmud Torah. There's a whole discussion there where the Rambam was mashmit the din that you can't pass until you're 40. And that becomes a big discussion among the Nesakim of the Rambam, the followers of the Rambam. And the Lechem Mishnah throws out a line, the Ke'enza shamaiti b'shem echad, shekasa b'shem chacham echad, shebezman hazeh lekam meira halacha b'fnei rabbi, b'pnei she'anu lemdin u'pisvarim v'asvarim hem hamalamdim. He's tying that in also to the under 40 thing. But who's the Shem echad, shamaiti b'shem echad, shekasa b'shem chacham echad? So Nachum Gidol suggests that the makar is the Marshdam. We'll get back to whether the makar is the Marshdam or not, but I want to focus a bit now on the Marshdam. I'd like to not just talk arum, but also go through a tshuva or two in our discussion. So let's take a look a little bit at this Marshdam, which is a big makar in this discussion of the role Svarim play in the context of Psak. The Marshdam is Shmuel de Medina from Greece, 1500s, big Paisik. So in Shud Marshdam Chelek Chesha Mishpat Siman Aleph, he writes that there's this big question he got. He's in Greece, he got a shayla from Eretz Yisrael. Talmidei Chachamim who are not yet 40. Stoch Negei Mamish Halacha L'Maisa and the Kolel L'Maisa, everyone here is under 40. So Le'gir L'Mem Shana, but you have Gedolim, you have Chasheva Yengalait Talmidei Chachamim. Either they can rival the elders, or they're even better than the elders. So what's the status? What's the story? Do they have to wait their turn? Do they have to sit and wait till they're 40 or not? Big question. And if not, if you say they can't be Meira, but what if the Kehillah was Makabel them? Can they go out of their way and say, Meila, you to start paskening Shpeseda, but if the Kehillah appoints you, maybe that can help you out. And in the Zichron Aaron edition of Marshdam, they point out that this is not just a Shaila Marshdam. This is like every single major Paisik of that Tkufa has a tshuva on this Shaila. It says, Mari Kurkas, Yosef Karo himself in Nafkas Reichel, and he references the Marshdam in his tshuva. The Mabit has a tshuva, the Radbaz has a tshuva, and all of them except the Mabit, the bottom line in terms of that question, all of them except the Mabit said that you can paskin under 40. The Mabit was the only one, so he was holding out that no, you have to wait till you're 40. And in fact, there's another tshuva of the Marshdam writes that I wrote at the request, at the behest of Rabbi Yosef Karo, I wrote because the Chacham Rabbi Moshe Mitrani, who is the Mabit, was being meicha b'talmidav, he was saying they shouldn't paskin, don't paskin, and Rabbi Yosef Karo wanted some assistance, so I wrote a ganze psak to support Rabbi Yosef Karo. That sheyoru mitalmidav, essentially Rabbi Yosef Karo wanted his talmidim to already be able to get into the action, and the Mabit was holding off. So in order to help Rabbi Yosef Karo help his talmidim, the Marshdam came and assisted. And so that's this psak. And B'chlal, the very fact that they're all suddenly having this question at that time is itself interesting. Usually if you think about history, there's usually not total coincidences. If everyone is suddenly asking a question, what was bothering them at the time? So without thinking or talking too much about it, but I would just say generally that it gives us some food for thought into how, even though every generation we have rabbonim, we have Rosh Yeshiva, but really, depending on the time, depending on the place, what exactly their role is and how the community looks at them and how they see themselves and what power they have and who do they share power with, that essentially really changes and shifts and morphs from every time to every place, depending on different details, different tanoim and conditions. And just a general word of caution that it's very hard. You shouldn't always. Sometimes you see Svarma talk about darkei ha'hira, darkei halimud, klolim and psak. It's very hard to ever compare one makar to another makar and one sefer to another sefer. Each sefer is really talking about, this is something where it's like very highly subjective, in my opinion. In every place, the power of the kehillah, the role of the kehillah, the power of the rav, the role of the rav, I think there are a lot of examples of this where even though it's all called rav or all called kehillah, but things change tremendously. So obviously this tells us that something about how they viewed rabbonim and paskining, something seemingly shifted at that time. Anyway. So he discusses the main question, and clearly he sides with being more lenient. But then he gets to part of the question is there a chiluk between the Zman HaTalmud and now? Maybe Chazal said what they said, maybe talk about, maybe now is different. Zok the Marshdam, for sure it's different. Everything that's said about the Hayra and the Gemara was when Kol Hadinim were Yoitz Malpi Asvara V'Akoil Al Peh. That's a true dayan. It's not the Talmud Chacham who's paskening. Kiyam HaSefer, the Sefer is paskening. You're just the vehicle to interpret what the Sefer says. Then he says this. So if the Talmud Chacham is taka badak u'menusa la'ayin u'bal svara, so it's obviously not one-dimensional. Obviously, the Meirei still has many requirements and conditions, and he has to be able to handle the material. But as long as he has the minimum, it's like a whole different standard because it's really the svarim. So therefore, pshita sheyuchal ha'eres, not only if he's equal, but even if the elders are greater than him, doesn't matter. It's all an equal playing field now. Everyone has svarim. And he says we can compare this to the other relevant din, which is a Talmud HaMoira Lefnei Rabbi. Erev, and it says you're Moira Halacha B'Fnei Rabbi, you're Chayev Misa. Shalei b'fanav is Asr v'ein Chayev Misa. So he quoted Orchos Chaim, very interesting quote from Orchos Chaim that tends to get quoted in this discussion. Orchos Chaim says that I believe it's Reb Moshe, the Rebbe of Rabbeinu Yoina. Reb Moshe and his brother Reb Shmuel of Evre, a place in France, like the late Bali Teves. They wrote in a letter, they wrote as follows: Miyoim shagalinu me'artzeinu, v'charav beis mikdashenu, v'nishtabshu ha'arotzes v'nismatu ha'lavavis, ein lo'imar din meira rabach k'meira shamayim. Oh, Perkei Avos, the meira rabach is mamish up there, put him on a pedestal. No, we don't say that. V'kol ha'din shechayev ha'tamid l'rav nisbatlu, all the chiyuvim, the dinim you have towards your Rebbe, all gone ki ha'sfarim, v'achiburim, v'apirushim, Hey, ma'meirim lanu. It's the svarim that are paskening. And again, they throw in, of course, you have the right seichel and svara to apply it. So therefore, the Bali Teves says, Nagu be'iram, that the Talmud could open his own base medrash when he feels he's ready to move on. He opens up shop. And that's it. Even though his Rebbe is still around, it's not really a Rebbe. So don't say Talmud al Yair, and the Talmud can be Seiser Divrei Rabbi if he disagrees with him, which seems like an expression of what was happening in the time of the Bali Teves, very independent-minded group. Generally, when we talk about history of Rishonim, you have the Rishonim that are more beholden to the Goyim, and you have Bali Teves that are more independent. So that's definitely the whole shnit. So he quotes the Orchos Chaim and says, "No." So you see that in that context, in terms of the relationship from the Talmud to the Rav, they threw it out the window. So in our context about Talmud who's being Meira, is he royal? It's not the same thing anymore. The Hira is also not Nishdas. It's not the same as it used to be. He says, the Ma'arik, there's a Ma'arik who also discusses this, and he quoted this idea of Hashem, the Smak Tzurich, there's a Smak and there's the Smak from Zurich. That the Smak of Zurich also has a Psazabin quote that was printed in the last, 50, 60 years. We have the Smak Mitzirich and the Zichron Aron. They say, we don't know where it is in the Smak. But if they knew what the Smak of Tzirich was, they wouldn't say that. It is there. Weiter, another parallel, I think that's Zurich, it's more Germany, Switzerland. Weiter also, so, but Marik pushes back a little bit and says, I mean, the Rambam brought these dinim of Kavod Rabbi, and the Torah brought these dinim of Kavod Rabbi. So, Zok the Marshdam, I don't want to really start up with the Marik, but you're bringing me a raya from the Rambam. The Rambam is the biggest raya fakert. The Rambam wrote the biggest sefer that you should learn from and paskin from. So, you're quoting the Rambam to me. The Rambam mentioned this din of Kavod Rabbi. No, he put it in, he doesn't think it's so convincing that the fact that Rabbi put it in, it's good to know the halacha. It's good to keep in mind that even if you're being lenient and liberal and allowing everyone to paskin, but people should keep perspective. They should know that they're not all that. So it's good to have that perspective as well. But if anything, the Rambam is a daya for kert. And again, he gets into the Shraga because the Gemara talks about, talking about paskening and not paskening, and mentions Megillas Tainus. Megillas Tainus was one thing that was written in the time of Chazal that we know for sure, and the Gemara says, no, even there, you can't look inside, you can't, the Megillas Tainus isn't different than other halachas. No, from here it sounds like, we're not mechalik whether things are written or not. No, back then nothing was written except Megillas Tainus. So we're not mechalik, and we say that everything is like paskening Baal Peh, so all the old rules are in place. Now, so he says, here he acknowledges, even though it doesn't cover every prat, and there's also machlekasin, but surely roiv dinim pshutim, most dinim already are there, are pashut, and now that's the roiv. So roiv halachas can be derived and deduced from svarim, and it's the other way around, flips around. We're not going to be geyser on the miut, because if you have the roiv. So as I feared to Rosh, that was his maskana. This is, like I said, discussed by many. I'm not saying every acharon agrees. Obviously, this is its own neisa b'fnei atzma. We're not going to get into every makar. And even within the Marshdam, pointing out different lines where you have to be medayek exactly what his vision is, what the role the Sfarim play, and what role our intellect and interpretation plays, and what the standard is for that. At the end of his whole shuvah, he says, by the way, that's a terrible matzav. We have many that don't deserve to be paskening, and they're paskening, and it's terrible. So even he was acknowledging that he's not fully comfortable and happy with every manifestation of everybody thinking they can pasken. But anyway, there's this big side from there, which he himself says, the smak tzirich. They have this idea which he is expanding. So back to what were we saying? We were saying that Menachem Greenwald wanted to say that the Lechem Mishnah, who's also shtangzich on the Rama of 40, he says, I heard it from someone. So who did he get it from? Then he got it from the Marshdam. And Alter Rebbe is getting it from the Lechem Mishnah, from the Marshdam, and he goes on and he makes additional points, Hagdaris, in this nice. I just wanted to add to that there's actually already in Tafshin and Aleph, someone wrote a very interesting likut, overview, whatever you want to call it, of these Mekayris that talk about Svarim versus Seifrim. And he also quotes the Lechem Mishnah, and he says, right, it says, Shemaiti b'shem echad, shekatz b'shem chacham echad. So he says, there are three possible Mekayris that he could have meant, and he thinks it's none of those, it's a fourth one. One, it could be the Marshdam, who's mamish the Rebbe of the Lechem Mishnah. The problem with that is that why doesn't he say it's his Rebbe? The Lechem Mishnah always quotes his Rebbe, the Marshdam. Zichron Aaron, they also asked this question in the Haris, if it's his Rebbe, he should have said so. So in Zichron Aaron they say, the Marshdam wasn't printed yet when he wrote the Lechem Mishnah. I didn't check their facts, but let's assume that's correct. So Lav Dafka, he actually had it from his Rebbe. No, so where did he get it from? The other marker is the Smak Tzirich. Says, Ata psakim ba'ayrois nichtovim akol yochal istakel b'sfarim. The psak ein atar l'rav kol kach me'beisayim. That's the quote from the Smak of Tzirich. But also Bishaya de Trani, the Rid from Italy. People may have heard there's a famous phrase, Kananas agabe anok. Where does Kananas agabe anok come from? The Rebbe, I think, used it. So Mizak, the Ershta Makar is Ershta Makar in Torah, because he himself seems to be quoting it from elsewhere. But the Ershta Makar in Torah, Ershta Makar in a Sefer is the Rid. So why is the Rid mentioning Kananas agabe anok? So this whole passionate shtickle. He was attacked for being too independent in his psak. It was personal. So he's trying to explain that the Sefer's in front of me. Let's discuss it, let's debate it. If I can prove my point from the Sefer, what do you want from me? I understand they're much greater, and that's where the Nanas Agabe Anak comes in. But it's not like if it wasn't written, then it's hard to say who's right. But if the thing is written, then we can take a look and see if it makes sense or not. And therefore, Yishlan Latur, Velachkar, Miteicha Sefer, Harayas, Abrudus, Velidus, Kami, Allah, Naita, and that's it. So these are earlier Mekaydas, he says. But this person suggests that actually the Mishnah was quoting from someone else, Ramesha Provincialo, who lived around that time, and he actually got into a major sichsuch with Rabbi Yosef Karo over a certain famous get. It was a big controversy at the time. And part of the issue was that Ramesha Provincialo was very independent-minded, and he was not nispal from anyone else. And we have his shuvas were only printed more recently, and he has these lines there that there's no kvar darav, and the second you reach Hayra, you're nifter mechiyuv and. So you could treat everyone with derech eretz, but that's it. So it says could be that was part of a major controversy. So it could be that's why the halachic Mishnah he alluded to it, but he didn't want to say he didn't hear it from the Mashdam. He heard it from him, but that had its own politics around it. So he alludes to it without saying where it's from. He points out that you have even earlier Mekaydas about this. He says the Kuzri. He says, you see, what's interesting is that at some earlier point, you see the opposite point being made. The Kuzri says, the Chaver in the Kuzri is saying that there are certain things that need to be said face to face. Ma'amid panim b'panim. Ki l'dvarim ha'ne'emarim b'panim b'panim yisrin al dvarim shebeksav. K'maimer ha'yadua mipi svarim mipi seifrim v'lei mipi svarim. But you have to get it from the person directly. The sefer is not good enough. He says also Ramesha ben Ezra, who also lived at a very early point, he also writes this line that there's a psa pisgam mipi seifrim v'lei mipi svarim. He says Lamaisa, as time went on, once these ideas that we're discussing, the idea that the Svarim or the Iker come into play, we actually start seeing the phrase that says the opposite. Mipi Svarim, v'lei mipi seifrim. V'chulu v'chulu. There are a lot of other interesting Mekaydas there, but that's, I have to leave that at that. Like I said, also, really, you can't just group everything that sounds similar together. Really, every single quote has to be taken at its own face value. You have to understand where the person's coming from, what they're trying to say, what they're not trying to say, how they differ from what others are saying. But that's that. So, in the Maisa, let's get back around to some of the shilas we began with. So, halacha l'maisa, nowadays, can you paskin on your own? We don't usually hear, I think in our milieu, often there's a respect and a deference to greater rabbonim, smarter, more knowledgeable. But you don't usually hear people say, "Oh, it's asur lahaydes halacha b'fnei." That's not really what you hear. And so you have these shayla. People are still writing essays every few years. People rewrite the question again. Do you have to ask your Rabbi every question that you have? Can you paskin on your own? So most recently, where I came across this. The Eitzer HaChachma has a forum online, and the members of the forum have a journal that they put together every month. Yarchen HaEitzer. So issue number 69 from Elul Tavshin Pei Beis, they had an essay by someone in Mechuyev Lishal Es Rabbi B'chol Heira a Psak Din Shepaisik. Hol Arichas, if you want to see many more Mekaydas, more recent ones as well. But his whole Mahalach Taka is, Leif and Klali, that Derech Klal or Rav is not as closely, directly important to your ability to paskin. Maybe you learned important things from him, but it's not on that level. Quotes the Marshdam, he quotes the Arches Chaim, etc. Later there's a Shvos Yaakov that talks about it. V'chulu. Many Mekayros emphasize that you shouldn't paskin before checking the sefer. You hear all kinds of stories of the Rabban. Before they paskin, they would take the Shulchan Aruch off the shelf and check the Shulchan Aruch. So Adrabah, if anything, that emphasizes that you're not saying you shouldn't check, but who's your Rebbe? Is your Rebbe your Rebbe, or is the sefer your Rebbe? The sefer is your Rebbe, so you check the sefer.
That's the point. Only if you're not being mekadosh din. If you're making up a new din like a Moshe fight, you need to ask it, go to someone else.
I think usually people will just decide on their own whether they feel worthy of paskening. They'll say, people, you call up the Rav, let's say it's heavy Even Ezer, it's important, the life and death stuff. So people don't want the achrayas. They feel that only Gadol Adar has the achrayas, has the plates. It's a different category. That's not saying I can't pasken in front of my Rebbe. It's just saying
that because the regular shadow that's already like from the Shulchan Aruch. Yeah, you don't need that because he can check it out himself. He doesn't need
Right. Happens to be that even in every halacha and Shulchan Aruch, there usually are chilukei deis in every prat. Well, when I was looking into this, I found someone wrote this whole shtickle about what do you do when you open a sefer and you see a bunch of deis. None of them are like the marker you paskin according to. Whatever he was trying to argue, he divides it into 5 categories. Some people say follow the machmer, follow the mekel, follow whichever one makes the most sense, follow the roiv. He tries to prove one way or over the other. But pashtus, most of the time, many of us think that, we do use our logic to some extent, and this makes sense, or this is what we're used to, this is, there's different, obviously it's complex, how anyone paskins anything ever, that's itself its own interesting discussion. But Ba'if and Kolel, Svarim are a much bigger, play a huge role, and l'chayra more for the average person, meaning obviously it could be someone who wrote a certain sefer. If he hadn't written that sefer, we wouldn't have this information. But once the sefer is there, I don't need him. I have the sefer. I can talk to the sefer now. And Achanami, he gets credit for writing the sefer, but I'm interacting with the sefer, and a sefer plus using our brains to whatever extent we have brains. So if we feel confident paskening about hilchos brachas, but nothing more than that, or maybe hilchos brachas is one of the chamuras, I don't know. But whatever you feel is something that you are comfortable looking and paskening, it's fine. If it's beyond your ability, so then you don't do things that are beyond your ability. But that's not the same as saying that you're not to paskin in front of your Rebbe. So that's b'chlolos. Even though you hear a lot nowadays about Gedolim and before that, you have Tanya. Tanya is also something we should be mentioning in this context, right? The Akdama to Sefer Tanya has a bit of a shtickle there about the role of Svar. It's talking about Musar specifically as opposed to Halacha, and he's explaining how Musar is more of a personalized thing. So I'm not going to get into the whole discussion of Tanya. I just should mention and acknowledge that Tanya has something there about the limitations of Svarim. Although it's introduction in itself to a new sefer, which the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Tanya wrote, so that was its own sefer, which we now, Tanya's the best of Svarim. B'chlal is also how Chassidish gedanken about the role of a Rebbe, you need a Rebbe dafka. On the other hand, Haguf, Mekan Zagen, Bizmanenu, all of our Chassidus and Rebbe is essentially mipi Svarim. And the Rebbe, people go, there are videos, but the Rebbe didn't sit and produce videos on Magia videos. The Rebbe sat and was Magia Svarim, produced Svarim, and that's essentially what we have. So if you think about it, we're also interacting with Rebbe and Chassidus through Svarim basically exclusively at this point. And these are all points that can be, elaborated on. But certainly Svarim seems to be major center around which everything revolves. Like I said, sometimes, like I started saying before, there's also the idea of like hashkafa, and there's in the world we live in today, where it always feels like there are people that are trying to change halacha, change Torah, and we want to protect against that. So to a certain extent, that's caused us to build up the role of Poskim, and the Poskim said, you can't start with the Poskim. But the question is how much of that is like a din and hayra versus we as a community are trying to protect ourselves, and that's its own discussion as well. Back to Hey Teves, so another minute or two. Back to Hey Teves, so that's that question. Back to buying Svarim. So l'chayra, based on everything we said, the pashtos wouldn't be enough to just have the basic Svarim in your house, based on what we discussed last year. You can't really paskin just from the basic Svarim anymore. Every tchum of halacha is huge, and there's so many developments. So the pashtos, if you wanted to apply the role that Svarim Taka play in this day and age into your life and into your Hey Teves, that would mean to buy dafka, a lot of Svarim, dafka, to cast your net as widely as possible, and you have to constantly update yourself, new questions, new answers, new Svarim. Now actually the same Yarchon HaOtzar had a shtickle on Shiur HaMitzvah B'Kniya Sifrei Kodesh, which we don't have time to get into at all. But he was trying to get to this idea of the Rosh, that you have to buy Svarim. He was trying to argue that it can't be that you're mechuyev to buy endless Svarim. Surely it's only the basic Svarim, and everything beyond that is just whatever. But when I read it at the time, and now as well, I would argue that, to say about a chiyuv, veisach nisht, but considering how Svarim operate, and Taka Amol, maybe having a turn of Shulchan Aruch was Taka enough, and today it's essentially not. So to say that that's all I'm going to have, I'm just going to have the basic Svarim in my house, that is to miss out on what the actual role of Svarim is in our lives. I just want to tie it into what the Rebbe said about this. There are two sichas from the Rebbe that slightly contradict. You have the famous sicha about Ksiva Sefer Torah. Look at the sichas Chelik Chav Gimel, Bamidbar Chag HaShavuos, and there the Rebbe says, obviously the Rebbe is pushing for Mitzvah Sefer Torah, and the Rebbe says, Ha'idna, das meint dass es mechuyev zu schreiben allein oder kaufen, alle Svarim, when as nur dann ist, wenn mekayim die Mitzvah, was Pirushayan, was it says, Mishnah Gemara Pirushayan, was Pirushayan is a ribi gadol, Meister Rav, Mezepta Poil, die Svarim, was Rav Yidin Kekulam haben, seine nit mikol sugmanal. You can't say that the chiyuv is to have every single sefer in the world, because obviously plenty of people don't have every sefer, or even all the Svarim they ought to have. So there the Rebbe makes the point that way. However, if you look in the Sikh of Teves, Tavshem Ches, Vayigash, Teves Tavshem Ches, the Rebbe begins a year later talking about Teves, Tidan Asfarim Natzach, and the Rebbe goes into the union of Ksiva Sefer Torah, and this Rosh, that Ha'idna, we write these Svarim, that we write the Svarim, we buy the Svarim. But they say no Eila, she'ein tzarech lichtev Svarim, mekimen she'yachayim lahasik Svarim hanet pasim, yesh leima she'yetzim yidei chivasa gam yidei kniyah Svarim hanet pasim, she'gam al yodem nase iker v'tachlis ha-mitzvah. Then the Rebbe says, "V'nimtzos," even though you have the Sefer Torah, which is very important. Kamakim kadei she'i alimid b'poel tzarech lilmid loy b'sefer ikri v'aklali el b'ribui asvarim ha'mevarim ha'mefarshim b'fratius b'fratei pratius as kol ha'inyanim she'b'sefer ikri v'aklali. So in this sikh, it certainly sounds like this idea, which I said was obviously exemplified in how the Rebbe approached learning. It wasn't a very limited list of svarim. It was Yeshimas HaSvarim HaMa'anyinim Oisi. That it's a tremendous number of some Ribuy HaSvarim HaMevarim HaFarshim HaFratis HaFratis Pratis. If we have to be Magdir, what's the Hagdara? So we'd have to say that Kanir Alza Chiyuv, Kanir the Chiyuv maybe Taka is, like everyone's tying in the Rebbe and the Kotzich, is that it's really only the basic svarim, Kosef Kosef, I guess in theory you can be Moitzi all the dinim from those svarim. But Lamaisa, if you actually want to apply it and you're a regular human being, the only way you're actually going to be matzliach is by having all the svarim that you need, the ribuy svarim. So you have to go through life and see, okay, which sefer felt this sefer on this topic, this sefer on that. So that's how you build the library of svarim that you need to actually be able to utilize the basic svarim that you have in your house. But you're not going to get there from just having the basic svarim in your house. And that's my thought for now. Just to add 10 more seconds. We start with the question of what about digital, electronic things. So, Papashtis, Lafi, Kolanal, but after you could say that, yeah, it's not a sefer, there's nothing specifically in halach about a sefer. What is a sefer? It's just a way of getting the information to you that was used to be in someone's head. So now if the database has it, Papashtis, it's no different. And if we can imagine a reality in which there's AI that can do the same work, so can AI replace rabbonim? After Lafi, Kolanal, maybe. I'll leave you with that. Chag HaSvarim Sameach and a good Shabbos.
It's funny because said that growing up, his father, they only